Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl with a special section on the latest developments in post-revolutionary Egypt. Mubarak on his way to the gallows. That was the headline in opposition newspaper Al Wafd at the end of the trial of Egypt's toppled president, Hosni Mubarak. Of course, we won't know whether the daily is correct until June the 2nd, when the verdict is meant to be announced. An acquittal will anger Tahrir Square revolutionaries. An execution will infuriate Mubarak's aides and advocates. And while Mubarak is clearly out, who is in? Islamists from the Muslim Brotherhood and the Al-Noor party have the lion's share of seats in Egypt's parliament. But in what direction will this take the country? Have the brothers struck a secret deal, as is rumoured, with the generals who have run Egypt since Mubarak's ouster? And if power remains with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF as it is known, what did the revolution really achieve? To look at this, we're hosting a discussion in our London studios. I'm joined by the journalist Nabila Ramdani, Shashank Joshi, a fellow at the think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, and on the line from Cairo by the Tahrir Square protester, Hisham Mongy. Hisham, thanks for joining us. Is it fair to say that there have been very mixed reactions to the final stages of the Mubarak trial?
Yes, I have to agree. It's a bit of a mixed reaction. The whole trial, from the start, to many people, especially the pro-revolution, the revolution crowd, think it's more of a sham than anything else, because basically Mubarak is being tried for a couple of pieces of land and crimes committed in the last 18 days of the revolution. For me and for many others, his actual crimes have been going on for the past 30 years. Mubarak swore an oath when he came to become president of Egypt, and for me, he did not abide by this oath at all. Many Egyptians have died in prisons. Many Egyptians have died in train accidents along the way. Also, our gas has been sold. Our natural resources have been used for his purposes and the purpose of his entourage. For me, it has to be a trial for the whole period, and for me it should be about treason. It's not just about 18 days. Moreover, the prosecution is actually trying to get evidence from a police force and the Ministry of Interior, who themselves may be implicated in the trial. So they are not getting any help from this respect. Also, the chief prosecutor, there has been a lot of claims that he's been, the DA basically, that he has always been part of the Mubarak regime. So this is also raises a couple of questions. The judiciary itself, although mostly independent to some extent, but it's not truly independent, and there hasn't been any action for this independence to occur. They still follow the Minister of Justice, who in turn follows the military council. So at the end of the day, the result of the trial, it will be not according to evidence, not according to anything. I think it's just going to be a political verdict.
Shashank, let me throw one over to you. The message from Cairo seems to be that the trial itself has suffered from a lack of judicial process, and that it hasn't really gotten to grips with the atrocities committed under Mubarak's 30-year rule. Do you agree?
Yes, I think that's correct. I think there's very good reasons why that's been the case, which is that a trial that fully exposed all of his wrongdoing, and a trial that looked properly into what occurred during those 18 days and the years and decades beforehand, would have simply implicated far too many people who are still in positions of power or in positions of authority in Egypt today. And it's in a way reflective of the fact that this is a half-complete revolution that has been stalled, that has been popularly understood to be hijacked by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF, the army ruling group, and no trial would really have been able to take place without also dragging in many of those people who were culpable for those crimes that we just heard about.
Nabila, the first thing you told me when we spoke about this before was that it is a farce. So I guess you basically agree with these two gentlemen here.
Yes, very much so. I think it's perceived as a show trial rather than a comprehensive trial covering all the crimes committed by Mubarak and indeed his cronies during all his time in power. And I think for all the right reasons, people are seeing it in that way, because effectively his legacy is still very much in place in Egypt. And the people who collaborated with him and committed crimes with him are still very much in charge of the country. So I think to have a fair and comprehensive trial, all the accomplices of Mubarak should also be brought in front of a court of law.
Hisham, in the parameters of the trial itself, is it fair to say that there's been a lack of crucial evidence against Mubarak? Is there a real lack of a smoking gun here, something that links an order from him to the deaths of protesters on the streets of Cairo?
Technically, yes, but in all honesty, if you consider Egypt as a company being run by Mubarak, if there was not a verbal order, although I think there has to have been a verbal order, the way the country has been run for the past 30 years, nothing happens without Mubarak knowing it. So there has to have been some sort of verbal order. Regardless if there's a verbal order or not, it is his responsibility at the end of the day. Assuming, which is really far-fetched, that he had not given the order, he could have given an order to stop the violence, and he did not. Not in any time during the 18 days, even on the 28th of February, where a lot of people got killed, and during the so-called Camel Battle when people attacked Tahrir Square. So regardless if there's a verbal order, I think it's still his responsibility.
One thing that I would like to perhaps add is that the impatience of the Egyptians is reflected by more and more calls calling for Mubarak to actually be killed. And I think that's a very dangerous path to take, because surely if the Egyptian revolution was to be successful, it should prosecute people properly, and it should, go down the route of the rule of law and indeed due process. And calls for Mubarak to be effectively killed are not going to help the transition towards democracy.
Can I just add one point? I think that's right. I think the problem you have now is loyalists hanging on. You have a ruling military council that is afraid of what will occur if it loses its privileges. And if it sees a former head of state being executed, you can be sure a great number of generals and bureaucrats and politicians who themselves were culpable for a great many crimes under the last 30 years are not going to happily give up their privileges without a fight. And it makes this process far smoother if there's some sense of fair and due process, perhaps even erring on the side of some leniency.
I think there is in no way that Mubarak is going to get the death penalty. And even if he gets the death penalty, he has still a chance for appeal. The problem here is, and there are a lot of people are thinking that he might get some sort of a weak sentence, and if this happens in the appeal, it could be shred in half. For example, if he can get up to 7 years, and in the appeal they could go down to around 3 years, this would be ludicrous to many people. But on the other hand, I doubt the military council at this point in time would give a lenient verdict, because they do not want to anger people. Because if a lot of Egyptians disagree on calls a lot of the revolutionaries want and steps they take, the one thing that most Egyptians don't disagree upon is that Mubarak robbed their livelihoods for a very long time. Another problem with why people are calling, you mentioned that people are calling for him to be hanged. The thing is, in the police and the Ministry of the Interior have not been restructured, and the judiciary, like I said before, has not been restructured, nor has the prosecution been changed. So at the end of the day, they are the same arms of Mubarak as they have been in some cases in the past. That's why people don't trust the trial at all.
Now, in his last comments there, Hisham was bold enough to make a prediction. He said, no way will Mubarak get the death penalty. Just to wrap this section up, I'm going to throw it to you. Can you make any predictions for what's going to happen there?
I doubt he will, but I completely agree. He won't be treated too leniently, because it's imperative that SCAF have some robust scapegoat for their own errors.
Nabila?
I think the judiciary should give the impression that he's being treated harshly but fairly.
Do you want to see the world in all of its diversity? Listen to one of the oldest radio stations in the world, the Voice of Russia, and you'll gain a comprehensive understanding of the most important world events.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl with a special section on the latest developments in post-revolutionary Egypt. I'm joined by Nabila Ramdani, the journalist, Shashank Joshi, a fellow of the think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, and over the phone from Cairo by the Tahrir Square revolutionary Hisham Mongy. Moving on to some other developments in Egypt, there's been much speculation over the impact that the parliamentary success of the Islamist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood and others, is going to impact on Egypt over the long run. On Tuesday, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohammed Badi said his group wanted a president with, quote, an Islamic background. Now, there's been much speculation over the role that religion and Islam is going to play in Egypt's future politics. First to you, Shashank, is there any reason for concern in what the Muslim Brotherhood leader said?
Well, it depends what he means, of course. It echoes earlier comments that we've seen from the Brotherhood over who is eligible to be a presidential candidate or a president in Egypt. Must they be Muslim or can they come from the country's minority Coptic Christians group? I think that some of this is a bit of a moot point, because what's likely to occur is that the presidency will become seen, I think, by many of Egypt's liberals as a sort of bulwark against an Islamist legislative. I think we're likely to see a presidency develop over the next 6 or so months that is probably going to be looked at by many people as something to balance out the Muslim Brotherhood's force in parliament.
Nabila?
I think there are undoubtedly fears by secularists in Egypt that the Muslim Brotherhood should dominate the political life in Egypt. I don't think that there should be, serious concerns about that, because after all, we're talking about a Muslim majority country, for a start. The Muslim Brotherhood is widely known for having taken up the role of the state effectively during the years of dictatorship by providing social justice effectively. And I think more crucially, it's very much seen as a victim or as a target of the war on terror, in which Mubarak collaborated with Western governments, including the US, in demonizing the Muslim Brothers. And that hasn't been lost on the Egyptian public, which is now recognizing the crucial role that the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist party can play in the future of Egypt.
Hisham, a year or so ago when I was watching the revolution unfold in Tahrir Square, to me it looked young, secular, pro-democracy. And what we have now, do you think that has betrayed the principles of the people who lost their lives in the streets of Cairo?
In fairness, the Brotherhood were a part of the revolution. There is no denying that. And maybe they were not there at the start on the 25th, but they were a part of the revolution, like it or not. And yes, I agree. People have voted for them. And I've talked to a lot of people who, for example, elections in Egypt were split into parties and individuals. People would vote for the Brotherhood, for the Freedom and Justice Party of the Muslim Brotherhood, and they might, on the other hand, as an individual, vote a liberal. So religion has an impact in it, but it's not 100% about religion. Like just said before me, that they have helped people on the ground and they have done the role of the government for a very long time. And a lot of people, by electing them in the parliament, have chosen to give them this chance, to give them, you have helped us, so help us some more. And in that respect, the problem is right now, and they are, I think, there has been possibly some sort of collaboration between the Brotherhood and the army, and we can see that in the parliament, because the parliament, people had hoped that once the Brotherhood are in the parliament, they can exercise some pressure on the military council with the aid of protests in the streets, and this did not happen. They had decided to side completely with the military council and alienate the protesters in the street. This is a problem. With regards to the quotes of Mr. Badia about a president with an Islamic background, he has to say this for starters, although I don't think they would like to have an Islamic president and as a Brotherhood and an Islamic parliament, because any problems that occur in the country in the coming years, there is no escaping that it will be their fault. Having a liberal or a leftist leader, if things go wrong, can deflect some attention on that president.
Shashank, Hisham raises one issue there, which is one of the big issues of the day. He suggests that there has been a collaboration between the Muslim Brotherhood and the SCAF, the army that are running Egypt. The issue here is, are Egyptians really going to get the democratic civilian control of their country that was promised by the revolution?
No, I think there really is a danger of a messy fudge in which the Brotherhood aren't going to sort of completely sell out. They're not going to agree to let the army have whatever they like or to completely subvert all the principles of a democratic movement. I think one of the big dangers is that, first of all, they have been very lenient towards SCAF on the timeline for transition. They have not called for a speedier transition to a fully elected civilian government. And the really big debate is still to come, and that is, what are the rules and the processes under which Egypt's new constitution will be crafted, and then what will be its content? But first, what are the rules under which it will be drafted and constructed? And I think the Brotherhood's attitude to that will tell us a great deal about whether they will go along with SCAF's efforts to preserve their privileges and write them into stone and etch them in at this point and carve out their own realm like the Pakistani army or the Turkish army, or whether they will push very hard and insist that the process fully reflects the new elected parliament and that this is not something where the army will be allowed to have supra-constitutional principles or their own special rights and obligations.
Nabila, you were also expressing concerns about this same issue, the constitution. How would you put that simply to our listeners?
Well, I think there's a new conflict have flared up between the Islamist majority and the secular minority over the makeup of the body in charge of drafting Egypt's first post-revolution constitution. Essentially, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Freedom and Justice Party, seems inclined to allocate half the Assembly's seats to MPs, whereas secular parties and the Egyptian Social Democratic Party hold reservations, and they would like to lower the lawmakers' quotas as much as possible. The next step for Egypt is now to elect 100 people who will be able to draft the new constitution. And given the success of the Islamic parties at the latest elections, the secularists fear that the Muslim Brotherhood would have too much of a say.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're hosting a discussion on the latest developments in the Middle East. I'm joined by the journalist Nabila Ramdani, Shashank Joshi, a fellow from the Royal United Services Institute think tank, and on the line from Cairo by the Tahrir Square protester, Hisham Mongy. Now, I didn't want to miss the opportunity of having such eminent speakers in the room without being able to talk briefly about the latest developments in Syria. Of course, we're speaking on Friday, and as we're talking, the foreign ministers from more than 50 countries are in Tunis for the first meeting of this group they're calling the Friends of Syria. This is, of course, against a backdrop of a surge in government attacks on the western Syrian city of Homs and mounting world outrage over violence that has claimed thousands of lives during the uprising against President Bashar al-Assad. The latest that we're hearing from the conference is that the Western and Arab nations there are going to demand that aid is delivered to the suffering civilians. Shashank, what are you expecting out of the meeting?
Well, very little, actually. Russia and China aren't there, and you're right to say that they've decided the only thing they can really ask for is humanitarian access, not a humanitarian intervention, not a safe zone, but access. But of course, on pain of what exactly? And that hasn't been specified. We've heard threats that we may see further economic sanctions, we may see other unspecified forms of pressure. But unless Assad really feels there are some consequences here, I don't see him setting a precedent of seizing his barrage or seizing his attacks and allowing foreign aid workers to get into places like Homs. I just don't see him taking the risk. He has no need to take the risk. And unless we can find some real way to put pressure on him, perhaps through a further tightening of an economic blockade, I really wouldn't expect anything to come out of this other than the opportunity for all of these foreign ministers to go home and said, well, we tried the diplomacy, it didn't work.
Nabila, what Shashank is saying there is that diplomacy like this, trying to get Assad brought to heel, it's a game of carrots and sticks, and what they are lacking is a stick. Is that right?
I think what they are lacking more crucially is a serious and credible alternative to the al-Assad regime. And that's why this meeting is called the Friends of Syria, because there will be much pressure now on the Syrian National Council to come up with a coherent group, to form a coherent group and a credible program to substitute the al-Assad regime. And that is very much what is lacking at the moment. And if you speak to Syrians, actually, they are very worried about what could come next after the al-Assad regime. I also have reservations about the practicalities of organizing humanitarian aid in Syria, because that would need to be policed either by air or troops on the ground, and Syria would certainly interpret this as a declaration of war, as a breach to its sovereignty, and it would certainly attack if external powers were to push for effectively peacekeeping forces to be present on the ground.
I think one of the hopes was the Red Cross might have been able to play a role. I don't think that's feasible. I don't think you could go into a situation like that without some form of protection. And as you point out, there are no credible third parties to protect them. But I think the hope was they could have found some way to do it that wouldn't have turned it into a foreign intervention force or an occupation force.
Well, I think, first of all, that would require a ceasefire.
Well, I think that's what they were hoping for. Now, pie in the sky, perhaps, but I think they had hoped, even if it was only for 2 hours per day or very narrowly demarcated, so it was really modest. They sort of had ideas floating around. I don't think anything like that's actually coming out of this.
But I think more crucially, Assad wouldn't want to provide shelter for defectors or indeed for opposition leaders either, effectively providing a truce and giving them an opportunity to grow stronger. That's certainly something that he would not consider.
Nabila, just to develop the thought that you had before about the lack of alternative to the al-Assad regime, does that mean that you share the opinion that was coming from Moscow and Beijing when they vetoed that Western and Arab-backed UN Security Council resolution?
No, I think the more crucially behind both the Russian and the Chinese vetoes was the example that was set in the case of Libya. I think the Russians are still very much rattled by the mission creep which took place in Libya, which effectively went from the protection of civilian lives to regime change. The Russians made it abundantly clear that Syria has been an ally of theirs since Soviet times on many, many fronts. And they also argue that it's a legitimate relationship, just as Western governments have a special relationship with a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, which is not a beacon of democracy either. But I think the background to the vetoes are very much the Libyan example.
And I don't want to let Hisham get missed out here, because you're over in the region, you're over in Cairo. And do you see what's happening in Syria? Is that the unfinished revolution of the Arab Spring?
That's for sure. One thing I'd like to comment about, though, the lack of an alternative, I think that is basically what dictators play on in every single revolution. Mubarak said that. Gaddafi said that. Saleh of Yemen said that. I think it's just the card they throw. There is no alternative. Basically, what Mubarak has told us is like me or chaos. And I don't think this is true. The problem with Syria is basically the veto of Russia and China. I for one, would have liked for a change instead of Russia and China becoming reactive. They could have been proactive. If they had called Assad to do such and such, and like the West did with Libya, they adopted the transition of power. If China and Russia had done the same thing and tried adopting the change of regime in Syria under their watch to avoid the influence of the West in dictating one of their main allies, I think this might have been easier. But with Syria comes another factor, comes Iran and comes Hezbollah, and we've seen a lot of their leaders because of their friendliness with Syria. The same people who had called on in Bahrain, for example, that what's happening in Bahrain is a massacre. They have decided that what's going on in Syria is an insurgence and people trying to disrupt the country.
That was Hisham Mongy, the Egyptian activist, calling for more international pressure on the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. I was also joined in this discussion by Nabila Ramdani, the freelance journalist, and Shashank Joshi, a fellow from the Royal United Services Institute think tank. You've been listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly. If you've ever wanted to find out what it's like to be a Russian living in the UK, stay tuned to the other side of the headlines and you'll find out. I'm James Reinl. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. We're always interested in finding out what our listeners think about the show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, email us at uk@ruvr.ru.